Kris Kristofferson had approximately 10 seconds. His 8-year-old daughter was holding his notebook open to a page he'd forgotten existed, a first draft from 1970, before the edits, before the recording, before the song became what everyone else heard. She was pointing at a line he'd cut. If he answered her honestly, he'd have to dismantle 7 years of careful explanation. If he redirected, she'd remember this as the moment her father chose distance over truth. She was standing in the doorway of his study in Malibu, afternoon light coming through behind her, the notebook angled so he could see exactly which lines she meant. "What does this part mean?" she asked. Not the published version, the original. The line she was pointing at named a specific street corner in Nashville. It included a time, 2:47 a.m., and a detail about broken glass catching streetlight. He'd removed it before the final recording because it was too precise, too traceable. The edited version kept the feeling but obscured the source, turned confession into observation. Everyone who'd interviewed him about that song had accepted his explanation. It was composite imagery, drawn from years of late nights and loneliness, shaped into something universal. He'd said it so many times it had started to feel accurate. But his daughter wasn't asking about the finished song. She was asking about the version that still contained the actual night. Kris set down the book he'd been reading. His reading glasses were still on. He could see her expression clearly, curious, not suspicious. She'd found the notebook while looking for drawing paper. This wasn't an interrogation. It was just a question. He had built his entire public relationship with his work on a specific framework. The songs were emotionally true but factually transformed, drawn from life but not documentary. He defended this in dozens of interviews, always with the same calm clarity. The art was in the transformation. The craft was in making the personal universal. It was a position that had served him well. It also happened to protect him from explaining what the songs were actually about. "Where'd you find that?" he asked. "The cabinet," she said. "I needed paper." The cabinet wasn't locked. He'd never considered it needed to be. The early drafts were just process, evidence of revision, proof of craft. He'd kept them because he liked seeing how songs evolved. The distance between first impulse and final version felt like evidence of skill. He hadn't considered they were also evidence of what he'd chosen to remove. She was still waiting for an answer. The line she was asking about wasn't vague. It didn't leave room for reinterpretation. It described a specific moment with specific details, details he'd spent years not mentioning in interviews, in conversations, in the careful stories he told about where songs came from. If he explained it accurately, he'd be admitting that the public version, the one about craft and transformation and universal experience, was a reconstruction. Not false, but strategically incomplete. If he deflected, she'd know. 8-year-olds don't track inconsistency the way journalists do, but they remember tone. They remember when a parent's voice changes, when an answer feels like it's been prepared for someone else. Kris leaned back in his chair. "That's an early draft," he said. "I know," she said, "but what does it mean?" She wasn't being difficult. She was genuinely asking. He could feel the shape of several possible answers forming. The easiest one was also the least honest. Explain it as imagery. Talk about how writers collect details from different places and combine them into something new. It was accurate enough. It was how he'd explained songwriting to her before. But the line wasn't a combination. It was a transcription. November 1970. He'd been in Nashville for 3 years. The career was starting to move. Other artists were recording his songs. His own recordings were getting attention. But the momentum felt fragile, like it could stop as suddenly as it had started. That particular night, he'd been coming back from a session that hadn't gone well. Not badly, just not well. The kind of session where everything was technically fine, but nothing felt urgent. He'd left around 2:30 a.m., walked back to his car, and stood on a corner for 15 minutes because he didn't want to go home yet. Not because home was bad, because going home meant the day was over, and ending a mediocre day felt like admitting something. There'd been broken glass on the sidewalk, a bottle, recently shattered. The streetlight hit it at an angle that made it look deliberate, arranged. It wasn't. But, standing there, he'd thought about how random details can look meaningful if you're in the right frame of mind to project meaning onto them. He'd written the line the next morning, exactly as he'd seen it. When he recorded the song 6 months later, his producer had asked about that specific lyric. "Is this a real place?" the producer had asked. "Does it matter?" Kris had answered. The producer had laughed. "I guess not." But it did matter. Because if the line stayed in, anyone who'd been in Nashville in 1970 might recognize it, might ask follow-up questions, might want to know why he'd been standing on that particular corner at that particular time, and what he'd been thinking about that made broken glass seem worth writing down. The answers to those questions weren't dramatic. There was no crisis, no spectacle, just a very specific kind of professional and personal uncertainty that he'd been managing by staying in motion and not examining too closely. But explaining it would require admitting he'd been managing it at all, so he'd cut the line, replaced it with something more general. Same feeling, different details. The change made the song stronger. More people could see themselves in it. But it also made it easier for him to discuss without discussing himself. His daughter was still holding the notebook. "Why'd you change it?" she asked. Now there were two questions. Kris took off his reading glasses. "Sometimes the first version is too specific," he said. "But specific is good," she said. "You told me that." He had told her that. Last month, when she'd been frustrated with a school assignment about describing a memory, he'd said specific details make writing feel real. Choose the exact color, the exact sound, the exact moment. She'd remembered. "It is good," he said. "But there's a difference between specific details that help other people see what you saw and specific details that only mean something to you." It was a reasonable distinction. It was also a deflection. She thought about this. "So you took out the part that was just for you?" Something like that. She looked back at the page. "What was it like?" she asked. "The real corner." This was the question he couldn't answer with theory. She wasn't asking about craft anymore. She was asking what it had felt like to stand there, what he'd been thinking, why that moment had felt important enough to write down in the first place. The honest answer was, he'd been thinking about whether he'd made the right choice. Not about music specifically, about the whole shape of his life. The Oxford scholarship he'd walked away from, the army career he'd left, the academic future he'd traded for something much less stable. Standing on that corner at 2:47 a.m., watching broken glass catch streetlight, he'd been measuring whether the trade had been worth it. He hadn't reached a conclusion that night. He'd just written down what he saw and let the image carry the question. By the time the song was recorded, he'd reframed the question as resolved. The lyrics suggested someone looking back on uncertainty from a position of clarity. But the original draft, the one his daughter was holding, still contained the unresolved version, evidence that the clarity had come later, that he'd edited his doubt into retrospective wisdom. Kris looked at his daughter. "It was cold," he said. "Late. Quiet." All true. She waited to see if he'd continue. He didn't. She closed the notebook. "Can I use this paper?" she asked, holding up a blank page from the back. "Sure," he said. She tore it out carefully, thanked him, and left. The notebook stayed on his desk. Kris sat there for a moment, looking at the open page. The line was still there. Street name, time, broken glass. He could remember writing it. Could remember the specific pen, the table at the apartment on Music Row, the morning light that had made the night before feel both significant and ordinary. He'd told his daughter the truth, just not all of it. The problem wasn't that he'd lied. The problem was that the partial version had become so practiced it emerged automatically. He'd explained the song, its construction, its revisions, its artistic reasoning, without touching what it had actually felt like to write it. And his daughter had accepted the explanation, which meant it had worked. Which meant he'd just done to her what he'd been doing in interviews for 7 years, offered craft analysis in place of emotional honesty, and watched the person across from him treat it as sufficient. She hadn't pushed, hadn't asked why he'd been on that corner, or what he'd been uncertain about, or whether the feeling in the song was something he still carried. She'd asked about technique, and he'd answered about technique, and the moment had passed. Kris picked up the notebook and flipped through it. Pages of early drafts, crossed out lines, alternative phrasings. Evidence of revision. Proof that songs were constructed, not transcribed, that the final versions were better than the first attempts. He'd always thought of these drafts as showing artistic growth. Now they looked like evidence of retreat. Not dramatic retreat, not collapse or avoidance or anything that would register as a problem, just a consistent pattern of taking what he'd actually felt and translating it into something more manageable, more explainable, more controlled. The songs weren't dishonest, they were just increasingly distant from their origins, and he'd become very good at explaining that distance as artistic maturity. He could hear his daughter in the next room, drawing. She'd believed him. She'd taken his explanation and moved on. No follow-up questions. No sense that anything had been withheld, which should have felt like success. Instead, it felt like he just handed her a template. For years, he'd been operating under the assumption that his relationship with his work was private, that the songs could exist in public while the actual experiences behind them remained his, that he could be emotionally present in the art without being emotionally available in conversation. It had seemed like a reasonable boundary. But watching his daughter accept his partial answer, he realized she was learning that boundary too, learning that some questions get answered with analysis instead of feeling, that depth and distance can look identical from the outside, that you can be articulate about something without actually being open about it. She was 8. She'd asked a simple question about a lyric, and he'd taught her, without meaning to, that the appropriate response to "what does this mean" is to explain how it was constructed rather than why it mattered. Kris closed the notebook. He could go into the next room right now. Could tell her the actual story, the uncertainty, the late night, the specific feeling of standing on that corner wondering if he'd made sustainable choices. It wouldn't be dramatic, wouldn't change anything significant, but it would be complete. He stood up, then sat back down. Because the actual story wasn't just about one night in 1970. It was about all the nights since then when he'd chosen careful explanation over direct admission, when he'd treated his own emotional experience as material to be shaped rather than truth to be shared, and telling her that wouldn't be a single conversation. It would be a revision of every conversation they'd had about his work. Every time she'd asked what a song meant, and he'd answered with craft instead of content. Every time he'd been articulate and distant instead of simple and present. He'd been doing it for so long he wasn't sure he could locate the unedited versions anymore. The notebook contained them. First drafts, immediate responses, details too specific to be useful. But he'd spent years moving away from that specificity, treating it as raw material rather than final statement. The process had made him a better songwriter. It had also made him harder to know. Not because he was hiding anything dramatic, because he'd gotten so skilled at translating feeling into craft that he'd started doing it automatically, even with his daughter, even when she was just asking a question. Kris looked at the closed notebook. The line was still in there. Street name, time, broken glass. Evidence of a moment before he'd learned to edit himself. He could explain why he'd changed it. Artistic reasons, structural reasons, reasons that made sense and improved the song. But the explanation would still be missing the actual answer, which was he'd changed it because the original was too honest, not confessional, not revealing of anything scandalous or dramatic, just honest in a way that didn't leave room for reinterpretation. And he'd discovered, over years of interviews and conversations and public discussion of his work, that he preferred having that room. Preferred being able to discuss the songs without being required to discuss himself. It had seemed like wisdom, like healthy boundaries, like the natural evolution of someone who'd spent years in public view and learned to protect what needed protecting. But his daughter had just asked him a direct question, and he'd given her a managed answer, and she'd accepted it. And now that pattern was established. Not dramatically, not in a way anyone would notice, just quietly, in the space between her question and his response. The same space he'd been operating in for years. Kris stood up again, walked to the doorway of the next room. His daughter was drawing, completely absorbed. He could interrupt her, could tell her the real story. But the real story wasn't more interesting than the explanation he'd already given. It was just more honest. And he wasn't sure, standing there, that honesty was more valuable than the careful distance he'd maintained. The distance had protected him, had allowed him to make art about difficult things without being consumed by them, had let him be present in the songs without being exposed in conversation. It had worked. For 7 years it had worked. He was just noticing for the first time what it cost. Not in dramatic terms, just in the small, recurring moments when someone asked what something meant and he explained how it was built instead. When analysis replaced admission. When he was articulate instead of available. His daughter looked up. "Did you need something?" she asked. Kris paused. "No," he said. "Just checking on you." She smiled and went back to drawing. He returned to his study. The notebook was still on the desk. He opened it again, found the page with the cut line. Street name, time, broken glass. Evidence of a moment he'd been standing in uncertainty before he'd learned to reframe it as clarity. He could tell that story, could write it down, could record it, could let it exist without editorial distance. But doing so would require admitting that the edited versions, the ones everyone knew, the ones he'd defended and explained and built a career on, were reconstructions. Not false, just strategically incomplete. And once he admitted that, he'd have to acknowledge it every time someone asked about the songs, would have to choose in each conversation between the managed version and the complete one, between the explanation that protected him and the truth that didn't. It seemed easier to maintain the distance, to keep treating his emotional experience as material to be shaped, to remain articulate and controlled and just slightly unreachable. His daughter had accepted that version. Everyone did, because it was delivered with enough intelligence and care that it felt like intimacy, like he was sharing something, when really he was explaining something. The difference was subtle, subtle enough that most people didn't notice, including, until 10 minutes ago, himself. Kris closed the notebook and put it back in the cabinet, not locked, but returned. His daughter might find it again someday, might ask another question, and he'd have another chance to choose between the careful answer and the complete one. For now, he'd chosen carefully, and she'd moved on, and the moment had passed, and nothing dramatic had happened. Just a small, quiet confirmation of a pattern he'd been building for years. The pattern of being present enough to seem available while maintaining just enough distance to stay protected. It wasn't collapse. It wasn't avoidance. It was just, increasingly, the only way he knew how to talk about his own work, even with his daughter, even when she was just asking what something meant. Kris sat back down at his desk, picked up the book he'd been reading, put his glasses back on. Outside, the afternoon light was starting to change. In the next room, his daughter was still drawing. The notebook was in the cabinet, the line was still in there. Unedited, waiting.